For our first ed puzzle this week, I'm going to take a few minutes to broadly introduce this idea of a research proposal that we'll be tackling this session in the capstone. And then we're more specifically going to go into what a research question is and a hypothesis and implications are, because that is essentially what you will be doing in your first discussion board this week. And so all we want to do this week is come up with an idea for a research study. You're actually going to come up with 2 ideas. And for each idea, we will learn how to write here a research question for it, a hypothesis, and some implications for those results. At the end, I'll let you know what you're expected to do for discussion board 1, and then I'll go ahead and show you some examples from previous students so that you can really wrap your head around the idea, hopefully. So what is a research proposal? Well, it presents a problem, which we'll call a research question, and then it gives the plan for a study that will help solve that problem by answering that research question. So if you were to look at a study proposal printed out on paper, it looks just like any of the empirical research papers that you read while doing your lit review. The only difference is, since you haven't actually collected the data yet, it's not going to have a results section or a discussion section. But other than that, it looks almost exactly the same. So it's got a title page, an abstract, which we'll add at the end of the session rather, an introduction, which essentially is your literature review, and then a method section that includes participants, materials, procedure, and analysis. So the introduction for the research proposal serves to introduce a problem that exists. So-and-so many, 35 million people in the US have major depressive disorder, and very few of them are receiving treatment or something like that, right? And then it explores the importance of the problem and lets the readers know what you already know about it. So good news, you already did that part. That's the difficult part. It's the literature review. And so you've already got all of that knocked out of the way. At the very end of the introduction and the last paragraph that we're going to work on this week, you propose a study that will help address the problem. So at the very end of your literature review, you probably have a few sentences that make suggestions for future research. So instead of making suggestions for future research, you're going to literally suggest a future research study. So very, very similar, again, building upon all the work that you've already done. After you propose an idea, you then provide some specific research questions, or maybe just one, hypotheses and the implications. And so we'll go over each one of those in this lecture here. And then after the introduction, you propose some methods. So what would you do in that study? What participants would you use? What materials would you use? What procedure would you do? So this will all be in future tense once we write it up. But for this week, we're essentially just going to focus on the one paragraph that's going to go at the end of your literature review now. And we'll just do it in the discussion board. You don't have to touch your literature review for a couple weeks, so don't worry. I know some of you are still sick of it from session 2. So adding on the research statement, that's what we're going to practice in the discussion board this week. And so it's essentially going to be one paragraph. That paragraph is going to include the purpose of the study that you're proposing, the research questions that you're going to answer in that study, a hypothesis, so what do you think will be the outcome? What's your prediction to the answer of that research question? And the implications. Why is that going to be useful? What can we use these results or that knowledge for? So we'll go over each one of these. But first, we need to wrap our head around and get a general idea for what study you want to do. Again, this is all going at the end of your literature review. So the study that you suggest needs to be directly relevant to the literature review that you wrote before. So after reading all that, what do we need to do now? What holes were there in the research? What conflicts were there in the research? What is the research missing? When you're thinking of potential ideas, it's really important to not suggest something that's already been done. So it needs to be different than any of the studies you reviewed in your literature review. It doesn't have to be entirely different. Again, it has to be on the same topic, right? But you could be looking at a different population. than the studies that you looked at. You could be wanting to use a slightly different method than those other studies did. Or you could be looking at a different variable, okay? So it needs to be novel. You don't want to propose a study that's already been done 10 times. What's the point? But it doesn't have to be something major that you use to make the study different. The idea should be specific, okay? Don't say, I want to run a study looking at depression. It needs to be really specific, or you're going to have a hard time writing these research questions and hypotheses. But we'll get more into that in a second. And again, remember those ideas for future research? That can literally just be turned into your idea for a study. So if you have in your literature review that future, quote, future research should look to see if this intervention is effective in younger kindergarten populations to see if we could use the treatment for that. Well, that could now just literally be your idea for the study. I want to propose a study that looks at the effectiveness of this treatment in kindergarten populations. If you're not real excited about any of the ideas for future research that you had in your paper, or your paper didn't have any ideas for future research, then you can just come up with an idea on your own. But at the end of the class, or once we finally get back to editing the literature review and putting all of your proposal components in it, you're going to get rid of those ideas for future research, and you're going to replace it with your proposed study. And so you can use them if you want, or come up with a new idea. Totally up to you. So for all these ideas, we're going to come up again with a purpose, a research question, a hypothesis, and an implication. So what is the purpose? You'll write one sentence or two that's describing the purpose of your study. And that's really important because essentially for these research proposals, you're trying to convince someone to let you run this study. Either you're wanting someone to give you money for it, or you're just trying to get permission from a review board to conduct the study. And so you need to have a purpose. Why should anyone spend time or money on this? So the purpose should tie in directly to all of the rationale and conclusions and stuff that you stated in your literature review. So how does this study add on to everything that we just read about in your literature review? What does it contribute? What's the whole point? The purpose can be relatively broad, and we'll look at some examples in a second, because your research question, which comes next, is going to be way more specific. And so some examples of a purpose. So the purpose of the study is to determine if mindfulness training could be effectively administered online. And so say you have a literature review that was looking at the effects of mindfulness training on depression. And in all of your studies, they had people come in for treatment to an office. And they said, future direction was someone really needs to look and see if we can just do this online, because it'll be much easier for people to access. Well, the purpose for your proposed study could then be, we want to see if mindfulness training is effective online and measure that. You could also have a purpose. Say you had looked at a bunch of studies in your literature review, and they all kind of found different results and conflicting results. Two studies found that it worked, and one other study found that it didn't work. So the purpose of your study could be to try to resolve that conflict by doing another study. We'll practice writing some purposes in a second, but really it's just one or two sentences that ties in your proposed study with the literature review that you did. After your purpose of your proposed study, you're going to have a specific research question. And so this is a question about the relationship between two or more variables. So it's going to be very specific, and you'll need to have the variables in mind. You can either come up with them, or you could look at what your other studies that you reviewed in your literature review look at. Essentially, when we write the research question out into a sentence, it's literally going to have your dependent variables and your independent variables in it. You don't have to explicitly say, my independent variable is X and my dependent variable is Y, but they will be contained in the statement. So again, we'll look at some more examples in a second. A research question should be clear and non-ambiguous. And so you don't want to say, we're looking at the effects of treatment. We're looking at the effects of mindfulness training. Well, you're looking at the effects of mindfulness training on what? So this needs to be specific and focused. It's going to include the variables and the population if you have a specific population that you're interested in. And obviously, it's going to be stated as a question. So what's the difference between a focused and unfocused research question? So an unfocused one, which again is bad, we want it to be specific and focused, might be, what is the effect of global warming on the environment? Well, that's not specific enough. What are you measuring? What is global warming and what effects on the environment? So we need to be more specific with the variables that we're measuring. So how is the glacial melting affecting, it's the wrong kind of affecting, it should be an E. How is glacial melting affecting penguins' eating patterns in the Arctic Circle? So there we have specific variables that we could actually measure. I can't really measure global warming. It's a broad concept that has like 100 different variables associated with it, right? So we need to say specific variables that you could operationalize and not just general concepts. Another example of an unfocused research question could be, what causes cyberbullying? Well, that's not specific enough. We would want to look at specific variables, at the effects of specific variables on a dependent variable. So a better one would be, how do aspects of online anonymity, including secrecy and safe retaliation, affect rates of cyberbullying in high school students? Now, you might be thinking, where do I even come up with all this stuff? Like, where did you get secrecy and safe retaliation from? I'll tell you what, your literature review and your previous studies, okay? You don't have to come up with anything off the top of your head. After you come up with a general purpose and then a specific research question that you're going to look at and answer in the study, you need a hypothesis. This is probably the easiest part. It's essentially just making a prediction about what the outcome or what the answer to your research question is. And so it's just your research question restated as a statement, as a prediction statement. So you can generally just start them as, I hypothesize that, or I think that, or I predict that. And then you would want to have a specific prediction for what's going to happen. You don't want to say, if we go back to this example, you don't want to say, I think secrecy and safe retaliation are going to affect cyberbullying. Well, how do you think they're going to affect it? In what direction do you think they're going to affect it? So really you would want to say something more like, I predict that higher levels of secrecy will increase cyberbullying rates. And I predict that greater availability of safe retaliation will also increase cyberbullying rates, okay? So you don't want to just say, I think it's going to have an effect. You need to be more specific than that. What type of effect do you think it's going to have? An increase, a decrease? After you give a purpose, your specific research question, and then give us a prediction about what you think is going to happen, then we're just going to give a sentence about what the implications of those results are. So if you get approved to run this study by the review board and someone gives you money for it, what will we use those results for? What do they matter? And so usually your results are going to help inform something. It can help inform policy decisions. It can help inform the development of certain treatments. It can help, do a lot of things. And so we'll look at more examples. But what will the real world use your results for? So how do we start by coming up with these ideas and these 4 things? Well, the first thing is that you need to reread your literature review. After rereading it, with a focus on the last section being your conclusions, your directions for future research, considering all that you just read, ask yourself, what seems like an important or needed next step? What holes were there in the research? What was missing from the research? What conflicts were in the research? What hasn't anyone researched yet that has to do with that? And again, you can use your directions for future research if you want, but you're not required to do that. After you have an idea, you need to check and make sure that it's a good idea before you go out and write your research questions and all that. So again, it needs to be novel. You don't want to suggest a study that is literally the exact same thing as what we read about in your literature review. It can be similar, but you need to state how it's different, because there's really no point in running the exact same study, right? It needs to have some little tweak to it, or it can just be, you know, a completely different idea. It just needs to be relevant to your literature review. It needs to be novel. It needs to be specific. What are you going to look at? Specific, independent, and dependent variables. And then once you have that general idea, you can just use that idea and write these 4 sentences that you need. So this is the instructions for your discussion board 1 that's on Canvas. I'll just read them here, and then we'll go through some examples of what yours, what a real one actually looked like. So you should come up with 2 ideas for a study, for different studies. For each idea, they don't have to be totally different. They can be similar, but the idea is that we want to try this twice, and we're going to pick the best one. 2 ideas for studies. This will allow us to pick and build upon the best idea, and will also give you some more practice when it comes to writing research questions and hypotheses. For each idea, you should explain it in a paragraph, and in your explanation, you should explicitly and separately state the purpose of your proposed study, the research question, the hypothesis, and the implications of those results. So it's going to end up being 2 paragraphs since you have 2 separate ideas. And just to be clear, don't come up with something random. It needs to, you know, be an extension of the literature that you covered in your literature review. So what might 1 paragraph look like? Well, this is an example of 1 paragraph at the end of a previous research proposal. So the first thing that's underlined here is the purpose of the study. So the proposed study strives to assess how certain victim characteristics affect the likelihood of reporting a rape. This literature review looked at different factors that can affect someone's likelihood of reporting a sexual assault or rape that they've experienced. But what the research that they reviewed in the literature review didn't look at is how gender, where they're living, and college enrollment may affect the likelihood to report. And so they're extending the research they covered in their literature review by looking at some factors that people haven't looked at yet. And so the purpose is underlined here. Next is their research question. How do gender, residence, and college enrollment for young adults influence the likelihood of reporting an incident of rape or sexual assault? So notice here that you have very specific variables mentioned here. So these are the independent variables, gender, residence, and college enrollment, and then very specific dependent variable, the likelihood of reporting an incident. Okay, so it would be too broad to say what factors affect the likelihood of reporting a sexual assault. Okay, that's what the whole literature review just looked at. And so you need to ask something more specific that extends the literature you just reviewed. The hypothesis for this research question was, I hypothesize that reporting will be less likely if the victim is male, enrolled in college, and living on campus at the time of the incident. So again, see that they stated a specific direction. I think that these things will cause reporting to be less likely, instead of saying, I think these things will affect reporting. You need to be more specific. How do you think it'll affect it? And then here are the implications. These results may uncover underlying issues that, if addressed, could increase the likelihood of reporting sexual assault. And so that's what we could use these results for. Let's look at another example. So the purpose of this study is to investigate factors that may increase stress in mothers of children with ASD, which is autism spectrum disorder. So this literature review covered factors that increase stress in mothers and fathers of ASD children. So again, this idea for this study is looking at other factors that the previous research has not looked at. So it extends the research by looking at additional factors that haven't been covered yet. So the purpose statement is here. is a typo, but this is literally just copy pasted from previous submissions. So the purpose of this study is to investigate factors that might increase stress in mothers of children with ASD. The research questions, for this one, she had 2. If you have more than one research question, that's totally fine. It's not really going to make more work for you other than writing an additional sentence. Sometimes it might make it easier to separate a big idea you have into 2 research questions and hypotheses. So these questions were, does maternal age have any influence on stress levels in mothers of ASD children? So again, we have a specific variable, maternal age, and a specific dependent variable, stress levels in mothers of ASD children. The second was, does maternal occupation or lack thereof have an effect on stress levels in mothers of ASD children? So same thing, just looking at a different independent variable here. So in the last example, they stated more than one, their research question had more than one independent variable. In this example, they're just stating 2 research questions, each that have 1. It's just a slightly different way to do it. Both are fine. Let's look at the hypotheses. I hypothesize that lower maternal age will increase stress levels. Okay, so again, you have a direction for each one. The second one, I predict that mothers with full-time or part-time jobs will experience less stress than unemployed mothers. Okay, so again, we have predictions about how it's going to affect it, not just that it will affect it. And then what's the implications? Well, research on these factors will provide insight into the development of effective support programs for mothers of children with ASD. And so if we identify these factors that make them more stressed out, we might be able to develop programs or support systems that help alleviate that stress, right? So that's what we would use this knowledge for. And so you're going to write essentially 2 paragraphs that look like one of these. Again, they can be similar, but we're going to give it 2 tries so that we can pick the best one. And then after having your posting your discussion post, you'll post both paragraphs in the same discussion post, both your ideas. And then remember that you also have to respond to a peer and provide feedback on their ideas and provide them with some help after you've done it. I know you might feel like you're not necessarily an expert enough to help provide them with feedback, but trying to critique and provide both positive and constructive criticism is going to help you when you're formulating your own ideas as well.